Bye. Welcome to the Hotspot. I'm your host, Arman Dezfuli-Arjomandi. Today we have a conversation with Mark Phillips, Helium's Vice President of Business Development and one of the company's earliest employees. He goes into great detail about the company's process for bringing new users and device manufacturers onto the network. He outlines the company's strategy and helps me understand Helium's competitors and the challenges that the network faces. He also provides some pretty awesome growth predictions for this year and beyond. Mark, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Arman. How are you?
I'm good. It's really awesome to have you on here. You were the first Helium team member who I really interacted with on a consistent basis. And I think actually you're the first person I pitched this podcast to. I was like, hey, what if I just did a podcast?
Yeah.
And you reacted positively.
I did, yeah. I mean, you pitched it to me at a time where the community was small and growing quickly, and the idea that there would be this sort of platform out there from somebody who wasn't part of Helium core telling the right story was incredibly appealing. So yeah, I'm happy you did it.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad you think I'm telling the right story. Trying my best over here.
Yeah.
You were also the first Helium team member that I met in person, which was actually kind of fun because there was a Philly blockchain meetup happening, and you were coming into town to do a presentation at the blockchain meetup. And I just happened to be playing around with coverage mapping. And so I built this little web app. It was like a very simple coverage testing tool. And I showed a demo video where I walked across the city of Philadelphia with a LoRa transmitter in my backpack and using my phone's GPS, and essentially mapped how strong the signal was to each hotspot along my walk. And it was pretty strong. Like, I don't think I lost coverage for the entire walk, which was very cool. And I created a time lapse of like I think I compressed 40 minutes into like 1 minute or something. But yeah, there weren't even that many hotspots. I think there were under 15 hotspots in the whole city of Philadelphia. But I was able to walk from like 20th and Walnut to like 3rd and Locust or something, 3rd and Spruce. And I never lost coverage for any of my packets. So that was pretty remarkable.
I mean, I've been at Helium for 7 years now, and I've done more sort of meetup talks and conference talks than I can remember. But I remember that Philadelphia trip very specifically because I took an interesting trip out to see a customer in Lancaster. Am I saying that right? Lancaster?
Yeah, Lancaster.
And it was just before COVID really made everyone's life fucking terrible. And it was like the last train trip that I took. But more importantly, I remember getting into the Philadelphia train station. I'm not sure what it's actually called, or the wherever Amtrak hooks up downtown. And I had like everybody on Helium's team carries around these like mappers, right? It's like the mappers that we have now are much more sophisticated, but they were just like these crude GPS, enabled LoRaWAN devices, similar to what you had. And I remember I had my laptop in my left hand, I had the mapper in my right hand, and I'm watching like an earlier version of What is Cargo. And I'm walking through the train station or the bus station. I walk outside and I started to get packets, and I was like, holy shit, it actually works. Which is not to say that we didn't think it would work, but like you always get that sort of effect. We get it less now because the coverage is growing at a pretty remarkable rate. But being in a city like Philadelphia with 15, 20 hotspots a year plus ago, I'm super cool. Yeah, that was an awesome trip. And your talk was great, and the meetup was super good too.
Yeah, that was a year ago, wasn't it? That was probably, was it January or February 2020?
I think it was February. Yeah, February.
That's incredible. So it was more than a year ago. That's crazy to think about. Yeah, I remember as well in the building that we were in, I happened to open my coverage app because we were on the 10th or 20th floor of some high rise. And I opened my coverage app just to see. And I brought a Helium hotspot because you didn't have one with you. So we were like, we're gonna do a live demo. We need to have coverage, right? So I brought the hotspot with me and I plugged it in some corner, connected it surreptitiously to this like shared workspace Wi-Fi. I was like, I hope this works. And then, lo and behold, I opened the coverage testing tool and there's like 5 hotspots receiving my packets, which was just like pretty mind blowing because, Philly has been a laggard in terms of hotspot adoption. Even now, like we're, reward scaling is 1.0 pretty much everywhere. So, we're not really leading the pack, although, I definitely have some announcements coming out soon that will hopefully help with that. it is really awesome, like to just go outside and see it work. Like it is unexpected, even as a user of the network. It's like, especially if you know the names of the hotspots when there's only a few in town, and you walk somewhere and you're like, well, I'm not going to get any coverage for a few blocks, but then you realize that one that's like a mile and a half away is picking up your packets. You're just like, oh my God, this technology really, really works.
I used to have a whole Rolodex of the early hotspots that I would refer to by name. I think I've even sent people Apple AirPod headphones engraved with hotspot names, and I sent Amir, our CEO, a champagne saver with a hotspot name on it a long time ago, just for kicks. So yeah, it never ends. It's fun.
I love that. The names is such a key thing for just like making the whole experience memorable. It was such, I'm sure it was like a 10-minute idea that someone came up with, like, oh, we should give them dumb names.
It was like, do we just automatically name these things like 774 XX2551, or do we let people name them themselves and come up with like totally random things like Arman Hotspot 6, or do we just create this cool nice thing? It flows very nicely from the public key because it's just a hash of the public key. And yeah, no, that was one of the biggest upsides that we did not see coming as a name. Yeah, I'm a huge fan of right now. Docile Bone Pony is a hotspot near me. The name is fantastic, but it's also just crushing. Like, it provides a stupid amount of coverage in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and it's like deployed beautifully on top of the building. It's glorious.
Wow, I'll have to look up the pony after this pod. So I wanted to give the audience a little more about your background and how you joined Helium. You've been with the team for a long, long time. So like, what were you doing before Helium, and then how'd you get here? And then what's your journey been like since you've been here?
Yeah, so I have, I don't know, maybe a typical journey for someone who does BD and tech. So my role at Helium is Vice President of Business Development. And although Helium's been around for 7 years, and we've raised, I think, 53 million to date. We still very much operate like a startup, which means I have a lot of sort of different roles internally. So Helium Inc. was founded in, I think, June or July of 2013 by Amir Halim, Sean Carey, and Sean Fanning. Sean Fanning, most people have heard of. Sean Carey was a guy I used to work with at a company called Basho Technologies in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And so Basho made a database called RIAK, R-I-A-K, which was this open source decentralized database written in Erlang. That's actually where a lot of the Erlang roots in the Helium network come from. And so Amir and Sean Carey founded the company with Sean Fanning. I was working at Basho, living in San Francisco at the time. So I'd been with that company for, I think, 5 or 6 years at that point, running sales engineering and open source community development, and a few other things. And I was asked to come take a look at Helium. It uses radio, it sends packets, you don't have to know anything about radio, it's IoT, blah, blah, blah. I had no idea what all that stuff was about, but I met with Amir and I met with Sean, and we sat down and met a few times. And it was clear that although I didn't completely grasp what it was that what these guys were building, the blockchain wasn't part of it at that point. It was IoT network built on known sort of RF modulation, layered with or married with like a cloud layer. It was clear that it was going to be fun as hell and pretty challenging, so I decided to join. So it was January of 2014, and so since then, I've run business development, which for us has been a wild, ridiculous journey. So if you do startup BD, you know that it's not a very concrete role. Like, you don't show up at the office looking, doing the same exact thing every day. Basically, you're just trying to get big companies to spend their time with you in an effective way, essentially, right? You need to figure out ways to sort of leverage relationships into making your product and company a huge success. And so now what I do is I spend time on the 3 areas where Helium is sort of very focused, which is building coverage, building the blockchain infrastructure, and putting more devices on the network. So that's my day-to-day.
Would you say that those are split roughly evenly, or is there one that's dominating these days?
The coverage is taking, well, let's see. So the coverage engine, right, which is the idea that the blockchain is doing a good job of incentivizing people to deploy coverage. It's save for the fact that the hardware supply is still a pain. It's kind of running itself, meaning people are coming to the community is starting to sort of support itself I think we were chatting before this. There's about 14,500 plus people in Discord, many of whom are like super helpful, like just spend many hours a day helping people optimize antennas and pick the right hotspot and, find locations for these things. So, I tend to spend more of my time on coverage, working with bigger companies who are looking at like deploying 50 to 100 to maybe 200 hotspots across a bunch of real estate, for example, and I'll try to sort of put connections together with them to make sure that they can do the deployment correctly. But more of my time these days is actually being spent on the sensor side of stuff. So there is a really interesting theme developing where larger companies are getting more comfortable with the idea of blockchain-based infrastructure. And a lot of these companies happen to be either already in IoT or sensing or getting into the space. And so they're plotting large device deployments, but integrating coverage deployments at the same time, which to me is so fucking awesome because it means we get to fulfill sort of both sides of the network in parallel. Because when we started, 2 years ago, it was hotspot here, hotspot here, hotspot here. Let's fire as many as we can. And now we're transitioning to where the people building the coverage are also building out the usage requirements of the network, which is like the dream. So yeah, so I'm spending more time on the sensor piece of stuff, and actually a lot on the blockchain stuff too. So figuring out what partnerships are interesting for the Helium Inc. and the community to make the sort of proliferation of the Helium blockchain and the Helium token sort of more integrated into the world in different ways.
Love that. Yeah, I remember that Amir had said to me, one of the biggest challenges in getting sensor deployments is that like when you describe the network to people, they don't believe you that it even exists. And so how has that evolved over time? Because we're at 19,000 something hotspots at this recording, and it's about to get a whole lot bigger.
Yeah. So the data and the tooling that exists from Helium and the community make my job in that respect a lot easier than it used to. Basically, like the way that an introduction to Helium call goes with like a Fortune 100 company or a startup, for example, that's looking to do sensor connectivity, is we talk about their use case. They've got a sensor that's going to send some amount of data that's deployed in a certain area. And then we talk about LoRaWAN and LoRa and how Helium is a faithful implementation of LoRaWAN. And then I say, have you done any reading about the blockchain? How familiar are you with how this works? And most of the time it's like medium level of knowledge, if not, less than that. Because these people have jobs, they're building businesses. They don't really have time to read white papers and documentation on this stuff. And so at that point, what I do is I pull up Explorer and I pull up mappers. So explorer.helium.com and mappers.helium.com. And I start with showing, a state channel transaction or a packet transfer transaction where we can see, 700 of the 20,000 hotspots transferring data from sensors in like the last 45 minutes. And then I'll narrow in on a city like Chicago or Philadelphia, Los Angeles, and mappers and say, listen, it might sound crazy that we have this army of people out there deploying coverage and getting very invested in the sort of future of the network. But look, like these are real coverage maps. This is entirely true. I can put you anywhere in Chicago. I can put you anywhere in Los Angeles. And it's smaller cities too. Like I can put you pretty much anywhere in Pittsburgh at this point, and you can get a packet from a sensor through pretty reliably. So that conversation's gotten a lot easier. And now what we find ourselves doing is a lot more blockchain education, right? So talking about how we decouple the LoRaWAN component with the Helium blockchain, how ultimately it's very important to the success of the network and then their use case. But I actually just had a call this morning with a company that's transitioning over to us from another LoRaWAN network provider who we won't mention. At the end of the call, I just said, listen, you can care as much about the blockchain as you want, or as little as you want. But for you, as someone running a business, you're going to pay a very small amount of data to send, over a reliable sensor network, and that's pretty much all that matters as far as I can tell. So, yeah, but they're getting easier, the conversations for deploying sensors.
Yeah, so I guess the conversation is now more like, so this whole blockchain thing, if it slows down, am I not going to receive my packets? Because I see that as a common misconception.
That's never gone away. I don't think that'll ever go away, because if you're sort of entry level with blockchain, you know about Bitcoin and you know about Ethereum, and you know that Bitcoin can be slow processing transactions. You know that Ethereum blockchain, can be slow processing transactions. Although I hear there's Ethereum killers out there that are doing a good job of helping.
Yes, there are.
Yeah, and so that's fairly straightforward. I mean, we can point to situations where you can go to explore and you can see that the blockchain hasn't processed a block in however many minutes, 9-10 minutes, but there's still packets getting through. So yeah, but I don't think that'll go away, that conversation.
Yeah, if you have like blockchain knowledge and blockchain common sense, is that a thing yet?
Sure.
You'll understand that like pushing millions of LoRa packets onto a blockchain and storing each packet as a transaction would just be completely impractical anyway. And of course,
I don't. So people don't want that though. They just care about latency, right? They just want to make sure that they can get their, if you're sending a downlink packet to turn off a pipe, right? When the water leak is detected, they just need to get there in 250 milliseconds. There are questions around, are you storing my data on the blockchain? Is it private? Is it secure? And obviously, answers to those are no. Like, you don't touch your data; it's all yours. But no, it's more about latency and expectations around like quality of service.
I get a lot of questions from people about competing networks and Amazon SIdewalk. Does that stuff come up a lot?
It does. So Amazon's kind of confusing in their strategy because they have two sort of, there's two LoRaWAN, as far as we can tell, two LoRaWAN products. So there's SIdewalk, which is their sort of Helium-ish competitor, right? That uses devices that are sold through products like Ring, and that definitely has a LoRa module. May not use LoRaWAN, but probably will at some point soon. Right, so that's SIdewalk. And we don't have any good data on this, but anecdotally, people are turning it off. Right, they're opting out of the idea that like your Ring camera should be a router for some neighborhood Amazon device. And then there's something called I think it's SailLoft, Sail something, which is their hosted LoRaWAN network server running on AWS. So basically, in the Helium network now we have Router, which is our LoRaWAN network infrastructure, and so they have the equivalent of that with probably a LoRaWAN 1.0 whatever spec compliant LNS LoRaWAN network server that they just expose over an API. So those are sort of the two things that they offer. I mean, when we think about them, we see them sort of competitively. I think we've probably seen them 2 or 3 times in like last 3 or 4 months in large company competitive conversations. Ultimately, I think that those guys looking at LoRaWAN is really good for the space. And so it doesn't really concern us too much.
When you talk about the differences between Helium and Amazon SIdewalk, which I've definitely covered a couple times before on this podcast, one thing that I look at personally is the fact that SIdewalk seems to be more focused on BLE and less on LoRa. Mm-hmm. So it's like more fitting to use cases such as I need to turn on my smart light and I need it to react with super low latency. Are a lot of the customers you talk to looking for that ultra low latency? And do you see the LoRaWAN spec evolving to provide that, especially on the like the uplink side or the downlink side, for example?
Yeah, so we're still guiding customers to only use the network for things that are what's probably most often called like soft real time. So let me see if I can give an example by talking about the opposite. So a hard real time system, for example, might be something where like a train switching infrastructure, right? Where you need train tracks to switch over to the other side to direct the train and the other information, and that's probably commanded by some wireless link. You don't want to use Helium for that, right? You don't want to use LoRaWAN for that. You probably are scared to use cellular for that, and you've got some very robust sort of specifically built cellular-based infrastructure for that. Soft real-time systems are things where you can tolerate some lag, and lag is not like many seconds. It typically takes 250 milliseconds. If it takes 425, you don't really care so much. So we're still guiding customers to do that. I think maybe in the future we might be more comfortable with that sort of hard real-time stuff. I do know that the LoRaWAN spec is evolving to make downlink more reliable. But yeah, that's the state of it at this point.
And as for downlink, just to explain it a little bit to people, a LoRaWAN device can't receive a downlink without having sent an uplink first, correct?
Technically, that's not right. So, but that's mostly how it works. So in LoRaWAN, you have 3 classes of devices. You've got LoRaWAN Class A, Class B, and Class C. Class A devices are the predominant deployed class of device out there. I don't have good data on it, but I would argue that it's 90x% of devices are Class A devices. And these are like the fire and forget sort of devices that send data once every 10 seconds, once every minute, once every hour. and are meant to run completely on battery for as long as possible. But with every uplink, you've got two downlink windows. It's called RX1 and RX2, defined in the spec. And so the device, once it sends a packet, is supposed to listen for these downlinks for a certain period of time. I think it's in the hundreds of milliseconds, maybe. And so at that point, you can send a message down to the device and tell it to do something or wait for another message at some point in the future. But yes, generally, you cannot, get a downlink message without sending an uplink. Now with Class C devices, you can do that. I believe Class C, it might be Class B. One of the two basically specifies that you're basically turning the radio on at all times. And so with the radio on at all times, you can listen for packets coming in. The problem with that is it sort of violates what LoRa is really good for, which is things operating on batteries in the field for a long time. But if you have something that's, because the radio will suck the battery like down to zero and sort of crush your consumption. That said, if you have a use case where you're plugging something into battery and it only sends a small amount of data, LoRaWAN is still great for that. Actually, back to that customer I talked to this morning, they put something that sits on the battery in a vehicle, right? So it gets power from a small vehicle and then can transmit and receive at will. But it is a Class A device because they don't actually need like persistent downlinks.
Okay, so like the type of device that would be appropriate for the Helium network is something more like a Class A device generally. Does the network support Class C devices?
We are looking at it internally. It'll be the sort of thing where we would need a large customer to sort of compel us to sort of add Class C support. I think we'll do it relatively soon, where soon is like maybe 6 months or so. But at this point, we don't actually support it. And again, it's kind of like a unicorn in the LoRaWAN world. There's not a ton of it out there, although it gets talked about quite a bit.
Yeah, and from my understanding, the best use case for that would be something like a smart light bulb where it's looking to receive a packet. I know there are like regulations around duty cycle in the EU and just like how long essentially you can transmit in a given hour that exists in the US too. I know I don't have, all the exact numbers in my head or anything, but that limits the downlink capability for so that limits the ability to build applications such as smart light bulbs, say that Class C were supported, or does it not?
It may. I would have to go back and look at the spec. I'm not intimately familiar with how the duty cycle impacts the downlink requirements. I mean, but light bulbs are hard because, imagine walking through your house, flipping a light switch, and then waiting a second and a half for it to turn on. It doesn't seem like that much in the moment, but it would be incredibly tilting over time. Like you just flip your switch and then you have to wait 1,500 milliseconds and then it turns on. So yeah, I don't think, but back to your original sort of assertion, I think that when you're looking at something like SIdewalk, they're probably catering to that a bit more, right? You're inside a house, you've got some sort of node that acts as like a coordinator almost, that probably has a LoRa radio on it and then a bunch of BLE and Wi-Fi. And then you're using that to sort of do point to point inside the home to do things that are sort of closer to hard real time.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to get at, drawing all these comparisons, is essentially it seems that SIdewalk is more suited to those hard real time cases and Helium is more suited to soft real time. Not only just soft real time, but cases that need wide coverage outside of the home, because SIdewalk is going to mostly exist inside the home. So that's when people ask me about that, which is frequently, I normally say, well, I don't really view SIdewalk and Helium as direct competitors, other than the idea that, or the fact that Amazon SIdewalk has LoRa in it and is adopting LoRaWAN.
And think about the difference between like someone deploying like a SIdewalk-enabled device versus someone on the Helium network deploying a gateway or a hotspot rather, right? With a SIdewalk device, it's inside the house. It doesn't have an external antenna. It's probably under a desk or something, or maybe on top of a table, but it's in the middle of the home, nowhere near a window. Compared with someone putting up a hotspot, right? Worst case scenario, you're on the second floor in a window, right? More and more, it's like 10 feet up on top of a roof or on a tower with a few extra dB antenna. So yeah, entirely different use cases that they cater to.
So what are the main use cases that you're seeing these days? Is there a main category that's dominating? Because I know a lot of people like to look for the killer app or whatever.
Yeah. So we used to struggle with this a lot because the Helium network is a platform, right? So it's horizontal in nature, and because of that, you have to sort of prove the vertical utility. And Helium in the past has built at least one. Well, I mean, most people know about tabs. If you're paying attention to Helium, you know about Helium tabs, which was, I don't have one with me, but it's a LoRaWAN enabled tracking device. It has a nice slick app and works with the Helium network. We had built something before that called Pulse. If you Google around for Helium Pulse, you can find details, and it's a nice looking, Pete, our designer, is going to kill me because people are going looking for this. Quite lovely. And there's some press releases too related to Helium Pulse and some of the funding that we raised, but it was a refrigeration monitoring platform for high value refrigerators. And so that sort of speaks to, and we built a sensor, I think 2 sensors. One was specifically to monitor temperature, and then one was environmental. Helium, I think Helium Green and Helium Blue were the names. I might be messing that up. And it was relatively successful in the short amount of time that we were sort of out there pitching it. I did a lot of the pitching and ended up selling, 10 sensor units per store into like restaurant chains, for example. And we built a nice dashboard, and you got messaged when things went outside of a range that you cared about, and got emailed some reports. And people liked it. The problem is we didn't want to build the full product. We get like 65% of the way there, and then just kind of got bored with it and went back to building platform features. So we've always struggled with how much we need to care about the killer app or the killer use case. I would say that right now we care a lot less, or rather, we don't get worried that we won't have a definitive vertical because we're seeing lots of momentum in many different verticals, which is a really good thing. And so, we're doing a lot of things internally to explode the number of devices on the platform generally, and we are focusing on some verticals, but we don't spend too much time thinking about where we have to, spend time on verticals, if that makes sense. So some recent examples for use cases, which I've talked about publicly. Victor Mousetraps, we're gonna do a webinar within a few weeks. I can talk about that publicly because I've tweeted about it and sort of because talked about. So Victor's a company out of Lancaster. Actually, back to our the story about the meetup. That's who I was out there to see when I was out in Philadelphia. So they built a mousetrap. It's this glorious thing. It's this big for the mouse and this big for the rat. And they're called the type of animal is a vole, VOLE, term that I learned last year. And so pest monitoring in the United States is a massive industry. I mean, globally, it's a massive industry, but pest monitoring in the US is huge. And so they sell to commercial pest monitoring companies that will go in and put in their traps, and then they sort of do full monitoring programs on these things. And so with Helium and LoRaWAN, they built a LoRaWAN connected trap. It talks to the network. It only sends a couple packets a day at the most. And it's perfect, right? You get a message on your phone via your app that you have to go and service a trap, and it's done. Right? It just levels the economics for what is traditionally like a very labor intensive thing, where you go and lay traps and you come back every couple of days or every week or so and you check it out. And most of the time there's nothing there, but if there happens to be, you have to clear it out. And then, it just costs a lot of money and it's a pain to do.
Yeah, just to interject here, because I was talking to someone recently about smart meters for like electricity and water, or I guess they're mainly water meters. But right back in the day, you had to come and have a person read the meter on each home individually, and then they switched to now what they do is they drive by in a car with a radio, and the radio reads each meter as it drives by the house. So I feel like this is like the perfect application for Helium. You could get rid of the labor.
Yeah, I mean, that's a theme in a lot of these deployments. Another hilarious and probably effective fix for that same meter reading situation, by the way, that I've heard from one large institution, was to put a Raspberry Pi based camera on the outside of it, and then just send pictures periodically of the actual readout of the meter itself.
God.
Why? But it speaks to the ridiculousness of how much money it is to send somebody around to actually look at a meter, right? If it's cheaper to build a Raspberry Pi based camera and send photos over cellular, it's got to be a huge amount of money to send somebody in a truck to look at these things every couple of weeks.
Right.
Yeah. So so I'm a huge fan of the mousetrap application. And what's really cool about the platform or the Helium network and hosts like yourself operating hotspots is that we've built sort of accidentally this very dedicated channel for people who understand that the network succeeds more likely if the network gets used, right? So what we're starting to do is actually make it easier for people to deploy these sensors on the coverage that they've created, on the coverage that their sort of infrastructure has created. So you'll see us, like I said, in a couple of weeks, we'll probably do a sale of the traps through one of our distributors, Partly Labs, who I'm sure you know. And we did this with Airly a few weeks ago, where we did a webinar with their CTO and co-founder, and the community can buy Airly traps now, or Airly air quality sensors. It's a super cool
carbon
sensor.
traps.
And yeah, that would be cool. Yeah, so all these companies who are already committed to using LoRaWAN are starting to realize how fucking cool it is that there's tens of thousands of people operating the network and that potentially want to use a sensor and a service that they offer. So that's like, we keep coming up with these things that you won't find in any other sort of LoRaWAN network out there. Another one is that like we have a dedicated team of what we call BDRs, or business development representatives, who actually go out and do active outbound prospecting for network users. So if you're a customer of Helium's, like Airly or Victor, for example, we'll put together outbound campaigns, and we'll like do cold calling for you, going after a target, and try to find the person that might buy your product, and we'll just say, hey, there you go, like here's an opportunity for you, and we'll hand it off. It's You won't find it anywhere else. It's super cool.
Yeah, there's a huge alignment between all the network participants, which is something I think is like pretty rare. That just the total alignment of the system seems to be very good from an incentives perspective.
Yeah.
Again, that I haven't really seen elsewhere. I'm curious how the growth has been over time, right? So you have these, I think Airly is very cool. Love the Victor mousetrap. Definitely seen you guys have a steady stream of new partner announcements coming out, but like compared to a year ago versus 6 months ago versus today, like how many new potential customers are you talking to like per week?
Yeah, so we don't really share those numbers publicly, but what I can say anecdotally is that a year ago we had one person that was doing full-time sort of outbound and fielding inbound requests for sales. We now, and they had a lot of work to do, but they weren't totally overloaded. We have, I think, 5 people now that do that internally, and they are crushed, right? They have no time left.
Wow.
On their schedules. Yeah, another really interesting thing that we're doing. Actually, I think we're gonna do the first one of these next week for a large. They started to deploy coverage in a European country, Germany, and they are doing so on assets that they own and operate. And so they're now moving into providing solutions on top of the coverage that they're deploying. And so what we're doing is we're putting together like a vendor showcase for these guys, where over the course of 2 weeks, we're going to put, I think, 10 or 12 network partners in front of them, people who have sensors and solutions that are using the network, and say, hey, listen, these guys have already fully integrated with us. Their solution is super interesting for your use cases, and I think they care about like residential and commercial real estate and energy monitoring, and then maybe one other thing. And it's really compelling, right? They get, in like 3 hours of their time, they get to look at a bunch of different solutions, and then probably pick a handful to pilot, if not put into production. So, anyways, yeah, we're overloaded on the inbound stuff, and we're seeing a lot of people transition to Helium from networks like the Things Industries and Senet and MachineQ and a handful in Europe, for example.
Yeah, especially when you look at the Things Network, which is, I think, the only one that's really available in the US in terms of LoRaWAN. I know that Senet, is Senet US as well?
They are, yeah. Senet, I think actually Senet does more business in the US than the Things Network.
Do you see a lot of people switch? Like, what are the main reasons you see people switching? For example, when I look at the Things Network, I think it's been a while since I've looked at it, but it was like an enterprise package basically that they have. And it's like they have minimums, and it's a per device cost, and it's just like insanely expensive compared to Helium. And I'm like, why does anyone buy this when there's something so much cheaper out there? Do you see people just like flocking due to cost or due to ease of use? Like, what's the main reason?
Yeah, so ease of use, less so than cost. For a while, we were playing catch up against the Things Network. So Things Network and Things Industries are sort of 2 different offerings from the same company, TTN and TTI for short. TTN is their sort of public open network server, and TTI is their private LoRaWAN network offering. Essentially, like if you switch over to TTI, you sort You have private LoRaWAN infrastructure that they help you manage. We were playing catch up for a while versus them on their console, for example. They had a really great console, and we learned a lot from that product, and have built a lot of features into our product that they had, and then we've extended on it. Now I think we're at parity, if not better than what they've had. But we're, they're in the United States. I think, this sort of happened as we started to come up, but they've stopped sort of. It seems like they've stopped caring about the stability of their network in the U.S. So that. Plus, we're seeing sort of discussions on discussion boards and people that come and talk to us. They made some interesting changes to their product that sort of forced people to do some migrations to their deployments that people were not happy about. And so they're losing some customers and users from that. If you shipped any more than a single device in production, you understand that the second something works, you do not want to touch it. You want to change nothing. Or you've got a hardware device in the field that's sending data reliably. You don't want to mess with it at all. And they, I think, made some changes to their API in the way that they did some processing that people sort of were caught off guard by and had to make some transitions. And I do think they're trying to actively migrate people to sort of higher paid plans. We've had, I think, at least 2 or 3 people in the last 2 months alone, enterprises come to us saying, hey, I'm not happy about the pricing changes with TTI. What do you guys look like? So yeah, that would be the primary difference between TTI and Helium. With Senet sort of positions itself as the enterprise LoRaWAN infrastructure provider. We've had some people come to us from Senet, but I think of all the 3 I mentioned, so TTN, Senet, and MachineQ, Senet tends to be the most reliable. And they're carving out like a little enterprise niche for them. I will say that I think we've irked them enough where in the last month, they've published a white paper talking about the dangers of decentralized networks, which pleases us to no end because it means that they're having trouble closing business because Helium is making it hard. Again, it makes me very happy. So yeah, and then MachineQ is another one. MachineQ is a Comcast company that seems to be a bit wayward of late. I just talked to a company this morning who's transitioning to Helium from MachineQ. Their business model is based around the idea that you pay per gateway. So you get any amount of backhaul or any amount of devices you want, any amount of traffic from those devices, but you pay hardware upfront for the gateway and then like some high amount of money per gateway. It's like 40 or $100 per gateway per month. And yeah, it's not cheap. In addition to that, they do something ridiculous, which is they'll sell you have to buy a gateway to use their network, and you cannot use that gateway on another network. Like it's completely locked down to the point where people have tried to wipe for and reload it, and it just doesn't happen. Like they're like, if you don't use a $500 or $600 gateway on MachineQ, you can't use it at all. It's like a paperweight, you have to throw it away. And so people are coming over to us from MachineQ, and yeah, it's good. We're starting to see a huge influx from existing LoRaWAN network providers, and on top of that, lots of new companies building LoRaWAN devices as the network matures and we start to show that coverage is real and that you don't have to worry about there not being coverage in a city, or you can build it out easily enough if you need to.
That MachineQ implementation sounds so Comcast. Like there's only one word to describe that, and it is Comcast.
Yeah, if you look at the Helium hotspot, right, that's only usable in the Helium network. However, the people buying those specifically are trying to create coverage, right? But the fact that you'd have to, you buy a completely locked TTN, by the way, is the same thing. So if you buy one of the TTN manufactured community gateways, and I don't think there's that many out there, but we've talked to enough people trying to transition from that to Helium to know that you can't upgrade it. Right? They run some firmware that can't be changed. Most of TTN is third-party manufacturers like Multitech and Tektelic and those guys in Curlink, and those can be upgraded to run Helium. But no, it's fucking ridiculous. It's absurd.
When you talk about coverage, what is the coverage currently of the Helium network compared to some of these providers? Do they have really nationwide coverage? Are they dense in certain areas? Do you say Helium's coverage would compete with them at this point?
Yeah. Oh, we are far superior. And also our coverage is very public. You can see it. You can go to Explorer and look at the coverage. You can go to Mappers and look at the coverage. TTN has some public coverage stats. I think their gateways deployed number is a little bit ambitious. We've seen numbers that are like 30 or 40% of what they actually publicly sort of put out there. Senet, again, they create really good coverage when they need it, but they tend to do it in very specific clusters, right? So they'll get a customer that's like a utility in a couple of states, and they need to cover like 30% of some chunk of land, and they go deploy, like multi-tech AP conduit, 16 channel outdoor gateways, or Cisco 64 channel, like crazy beast gateways, and they create really good coverage. But it's very, again, it's for a constrained sort of geography. But no, I mean, we're in, I think, 60 countries, 3,200 cities. Somebody who knows a lot about networks recently told us that we have the largest contiguous wireless network in the world, which is fun to think about. I think the argument sort of falls over a bit, because you can't put a LoRa device, you can't use the same LoRaWAN device in the United States that you can in Europe, for example, because they require different modules and sort of different circuitry. But I think in spirit, it's right. I mean, like, the Helium network exists in 60 different countries. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, one thing that I've been really curious to see, I know someone internally was working on it at some point. I don't know if it got ditched, but is essentially the heat map based coverage map based on witness data, so that you can create actual, like blobs of coverage, kind of like the carriers pay millions of people to go out and do, kind of like the mappers are doing for free right now on a volunteer basis, but based on the blockchain witness data.
Yeah, Kent on my team probably was the person doing that, and I don't know what the status of it is, but he's a beast. He'll probably produce it pretty soon. Yeah, I would. That would. He's evolving mappers in a pretty aggressive way to go from just, like you said, the mapper sensor itself to things like witness data from the blockchain. So yeah, and that's just another sort of thing that that the Helium network does that, again, traditionally costs many billions of dollars to do. You don't map infrastructure like the cellular networks. Now, we do understand there's some shortcomings to our approach, and so we're sort of adapting that. So one of the things that we're doing, I think Coco and the team are working on this in the mobile app, is when you deploy Hotspot for the first time, we will enable you to basically send packets out automatically, right, using the mobile app to say, like, hey, like, can any other hotspots hear this thing? Instead of like jumping into Discord and start asking questions about, how do I optimize my antenna? Like, we should just give you the tool to send a couple packets, and maybe it costs a data credit or two, to figure out exactly what kind of coverage you're creating. So, cellular networks do this. Like, they don't put up a base station without knowing exactly what it can talk to and how it's optimized. And so we need to get a little bit better about that, for sure.
Yeah, I'd love to see those coverage maps come to life. I think it's going to be one thing I really want to see is the percentage population covered, because this is like the metric that all the cellular networks go by. They're like, we cover 98% of US population. And the thing is, the data is all there, right? Like, you can create the coverage heat map on witness data, and you can get population data for every zip code in the country, and obviously for other countries as well.
Yeah, I mean, I have no idea what that number would be right now, but I'm sure we can come up with a good commercial.
I think it would be pretty impressive. I mean, in major US cities, we've got great coverage. Like, I would say Chicago is fully covered. LA is definitely probably like 90% covered.
Yeah.
I mean, San Francisco, not a huge city, but definitely covered. Philadelphia's got pretty good coverage at this point.
New York City.
Oh my God, New York City. Yeah, like fully covered.
We're definitely well into the hundreds of millions, I think, for individuals. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
That's a staggering stat. I mean, it would be great to create a historical sort of trend line of percentage of population covered. I think that would be like the ultimate, because the ultimate goal is 100%. And so, like, how quickly can we get to 100%? How quickly can we get to 20 or 30% of, single countries, then of the world? I think would be an amazing, incredible stat to look at. And so if you guys aren't building that internally, I'll task someone. I'll try to get someone to do that.
Yeah, you should. I'll relay that to Emily, but that would be super cool.
So, and on the topic of coverage and customers, I know that these sort of more corporate networks are able to offer SLAs to their customers, and the Helium network. I mean, I think we have very good redundancy in cities, right? Like, as I said, even a year ago, I could get 5 hotspots to hear me in a spot in Philly. Nowadays, if I walk through, I'm sure I'll get like multiple X, 5 to 20X redundancy based on where I'm standing. But how are the customers thinking about reliability, and what's your pitch to them based on reliability?
Yeah, so if you're building something on a LoRaWAN network, you're already sort of okay with the idea that you're sending data that could be a bit lossy, right? That might take more than one try to sort of transmit. So from that sort of mental model, it gets a lot easier because again, you've already decided that you're not going to use cellular. You don't have to. You're not going to use that link. We do internally have an SLA that we offer customers around quality of service. It's constructed more similarly to how AWS, for example, does uptime, right? So if you are using AWS and there's like 3% downtime or something, they'll give you some amount of credit against the amount that you spent. And we'll do the same thing internally. But more and more what we're seeing, again, is customers who are okay with the idea that they're going to deploy some amount of coverage to sort of, make what they have a little bit better. Because on the enterprise level, people were generally on board with this as it was. So again, they're committed to LoRa. I'm an enterprise. I'm going to deploy a LoRaWAN network. I'm going to have to buy some hardware. In a lot of cases now, you don't have to deploy hardware to create coverage, or you have to deploy a lot less than you thought you would. So people are generally okay with that because there's already a massive capital savings there versus what they had planned to spend with somebody else like Senet or MachineQ or TTN, for example. So yeah, it's evolving. We also one example of a good, really interesting use case that we just brought on. I think they officially signed up last week. It's not public yet, so I won't share their name. But they operate hundreds, I think thousands of trucks in the Northeast that go between the Boston area and Washington, D.C., and they service like commercial real estate buildings and restaurants, and they do things like clean linens, for example. And their CEO is all in on Helium. He had a proposal on his table from one of the major MNOs to do like cellular backtracking for trucks, and they had done a pilot with Helium. And he looked at the coverage and said, "Yeah, we're missing some gaps here. Driving through Providence, Rhode Island, there's some spots where I don't have a packet from my truck, but I'll put up some more hotspots, and I primarily care about knowing when something left a distribution facility and ended at a customer, and conversely, when they left the customer and got back to my facility. If the data shows up in the middle, which more and more it will over time, I can live with that, right? So some of our customers are more flexible. They're required to be a lot less flexible than they used to be, if that makes sense. The use cases are adapting to suit the network. At the same time, the coverage is being every day is being filled in different areas. So does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. I think what's so funny and awesome is that if they're signing up with MachineQ or TTN and buying all these proprietary hardware devices, it's like a significant capital expenditure. Meanwhile, on the Helium side, you've got the Helium hotspots now manufactured by at least 4 different manufacturers, which are going down in price over time, right? We hope to see light hotspots under $150 by the end of the year.
Yeah.
And so not only does it go down over time, like you could imagine seeing a $50 or $100 hotspot eventually, but it actually pays you to operate it. So I don't know how from a business perspective, if the functionality is equal or better, if the ease of use and ease of access is equal or better, if the cost of using the network is equal or better, and if you can also piggyback on this public coverage in many of the areas you're serving and you want to build private coverage, I mean, you essentially are partially funding your own business by deploying hotspots along the way. And it's just crazy to think about. How could a company look at, oh, I need to deploy 10 of these really high power gateways at $600 pop. It's going to cost me $6,000 versus, oh, I only have to deploy 3 out of 10 because there's already coverage in most of my areas. And it's only going to cost me $1,000 to buy the 3. And, they're going to earn me back some number of HNT, which I can trade back to eventually, hopefully get back my initial investment. It's just like a very tough sell for the other corporate providers.
Yeah, I think that's mostly right. I will say that some situations do require, outdoor sort of ruggedized, larger, antennas, right? Where you're going to be spending $500 to $1,000, maybe more than that, plus some amount of labor to sort of deploy this thing. And I will concede that a lot of these deployments do require sort of more traditional coverage. But again, it all contributes to the growth of the network, right? Everybody gets to use this coverage as it gets deployed. I have, we used to get a lot of questions from enterprises that were like, oh, this is really interesting, but I can make my coverage private, right? You guys can turn it off and make sure that nobody else can use this. And the answer is no, we can't. And they said, but you can, right? No, we can't, man. I mean, if you don't want to use the network, we'll be sad, but we understand it. But this is a public network, you're creating coverage for yourself. And, the blockchain is sort of rewarding you with HND for doing that. And a few people have said, not for me, but most of them sort of come around to the idea. The funniest sort of thing is when people ask for exclusivity, which is a pretty common thing for enterprises to do, where they say like, we'd like to be the only, I don't know, widget manufacturer that does X on the Helium network. Can you guys, we're going to put 200,000 devices on the network this year. We'd like some exclusivity. And my response is typically like, firstly, we can't. It's an open network. Anybody can use it as long as you have a data credit to send data and there's coverage, you can get on it. But the really cool thing, and this company was considering rolling out like massive amounts of coverage. I said something like, think of it this way. You're worried about competition. If you go and deploy a bunch of network coverage as part of your application and your customers end up, or your competitors end up using the network coverage that you've built, they're going to be paying you to use the network. And the guy was like, oh, okay, I get it. And so there's so many aspects to this that you don't get anywhere else. Like you don't get customers that invested in the success of the infrastructure that you're using. It's like entirely unique.
When you're doing all this like business development, well, first of all, I want to touch on something, a little nugget that you said there. You said that someone you threw out the number 200,000 by the end of the year. Was that just a random number, or are people actually proposing things this big and this immediate?
I mean, that was an actual number that person suggested in the conversation, for sure. I mean, we're dealing with customers and companies that are, projecting, this is part of the progression. We go from developers to small companies to bigger companies that sort of get on board as the network gets more reliable. But, if you're talking to an enterprise that's looking at doing maybe consumer device, I mean, they think in numbers of like, 5 figures is low, right? It's a 6 or 7 figure sort of engagement for them on a certain timeline. So, those conversations are pretty standard.
Yeah, when you look at the amount of device usage on the network now, it's really slow. It's very small, right? And I've always had this idea that there is going to be some just like incredible ramp up. Is that kind of what you see happening? Like, is it going to be sort of an all at once type thing where the devices, like a huge partner starts deploying devices and then like the usage just skyrockets kind of overnight? Or is it going to be more of a slow burn with smaller partners coming in here and there?
Yeah, I'm going to butcher this phrase, but it's something like it's very slow and then it's very fast. Like it's
a trickle then a flood.
Yeah. So we're sort of transitioning from the trickle to the flood, I would say. Again, now the sort of inbound conversations that we get, table stakes are people planning device deployments that are tens of thousands and above. And so I mean that's the direction that we're going.
When you're doing all this business development activity and you have your in-house team and you're offering people SLAs and specific packages and helping them do outbound and all this stuff, do you think of that as like a startup, like scrappy, like let's get the ball rolling, let's get some major momentum going type thing, and then eventually this will sort of be rolling on its own? Or do you view that as this is going to be a sustained push internally always, and we're going to continue expanding the team within Helium Inc. and continue offering these services and SLAs and help?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have a good answer for you. I can tell you that we still every day wake up we're a paranoid startup that thinks that we could be out of business at any point, right? I mean, we have plenty of money in the bank and we're not going anywhere, but that's our mental model, right? We so our if you look at the Helium roadmap on the site, there's 3 areas, right? It's coverage, it's devices, and it's the blockchain core sort of development. But we are just scrapping and hustling and grinding to build as much coverage as we can and put as many devices on the network as quickly as possible. And the most impactful thing that we can do from a business development standpoint is to put devices on the network and improve its utility. So, I mean, so offering customers, and we do this for free, like it's not a paid thing, right? It's hey, like you're part of the Helium network. Here's Marvin from our BD team. He's going to call you and learn your messaging, and then our team is going to do some outbound for you next week. It's just something that we do for the partners because we want them to succeed because the network grows bigger if they succeed, and everybody sort of rides the wave.
You always have to start somewhere, right, with a startup. And I think, from an outsider's perspective, you guys are well past the scrappy startup stage because, you've just got a lot of experienced people on the team constantly churning out, new products that are in production and stuff like that. But, at the same time, I also see how success isn't guaranteed. And, you've got to get a lot of wheels cranking. Like you can't just sit back and twiddle your thumbs, there could be a competitor. Kind of going back to what we were talking about before with like Amazon SIdewalk, and is there a competitor? Like, I think we talked about this on episode 3 with Tushar. Helium doesn't seem to have a fully direct competitor, like at all. Do you see it that way, or?
I would agree. Like, there's no natural direct competitors. There's a handful. We've talked about them here. The LoRaWAN network providers that are competing with us to put devices on their LoRaWAN network. And then there's like some weird fly-by-night sort of wireless crypto mining things out there. We won't even warrant mentions on this thing.
I won't mention it. I don't want to get in trouble here.
But no, there's no one who is sort of combining this innovative incentive mechanism with an actual useful wireless network. It doesn't exist.
Yeah, that's the craziest part to me, is that
it's less crazy now. I mean, the concept is less crazy now than it used to be, is what I'm saying.
Certainly.
Yeah.
But the fact that there hasn't been like a fork of the Helium blockchain yet with someone trying to do something, well, I think part of the reason that hasn't happened is just your sheer velocity, right? And the number of unsolved problems still. Like, for example, the chain struggling with the new hotspots coming online, and then developing validators, which is like we just spun up the testnet, and I'm sure we'll be in mainnet within a few weeks. I don't think anyone who tries to fork the Helium blockchain right now is getting like this complete fully working, fully scalable product. So, and like if they want to build their own blockchain, it's going to be so much damn work to get started from scratch, even though they can use a lot of the lessons from Helium. Why wouldn't you just fork instead of, I just don't see a path for someone who wants to fork, nor do I see a path for someone who wants to start from scratch and build their own hardware for LoRaWAN network.
Yeah, well, I mean, the hardware part is particularly hard because there's no hardware to be had. It's completely gone, right? All the suppliers are completely tapped out of LoRaWAN components. Helium certainly contributed to that. Plus, the Helium blockchain is written in Erlang, right? There's only like 30 developers in the world who know how to write it anyways. So I'm joking, there's much more than that. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, we've discussed internally what would happen if someone forked it and the potential to do so. I think we sort of I guess we'd smile a bit because it would confer some amount of sort of notoriety on us and some success. But yeah, go ahead and fork it. Let's see what happens. It doesn't really worry me too much.
It's an open challenge. Mark Phillips, 2021. Go and fork it and see what happens.
But well, I mean, I think we also have the intent. We have a ton of velocity from a sort of Helium Inc., but also community development perspective. I mean, every day more and more we're starting to get more pull requests and contributions from people who aren't paid to work on this full time, and that's the vision. Right? We're trying to make this a fully decentralized sort of development effort. But also the community momentum itself is just ridiculous, right? The tens of thousands of people who are in Discord sort of like eating up every nugget of information that people are sort of sharing. And you see it with deploying hotspots, people who are just like so dedicated to expanding coverage and sort of educating people. I mean, just like the validator testnet launch, which was what 2 or 3 days ago, the pace and sort of rapacity with which people jumped in and started hammering on the validator branch and firing up testnet nodes and reporting issues and filing documentation and cutting PRs, it was just like, what? This is ridiculous. So yeah, I mean, again, you'll have a hard time assembling that on another network.
Yeah, the validators were particularly incredible because I think within like less than 12 hours, we got to 50, like after the testnet launch. And that's not like 5 people running 10 each. That's like 50 individuals who all like slurped up the documentation the second that it came out, fired up these different testnet nodes, like figured out what was going wrong with theirs. It was pretty smooth. I fired one up and it was very smooth. So kudos to the team on like an easy.
You had the
first one. I did fire up the first non-Helium Inc. testnet node, which is a badge of honor I will wear. I don't know who will care, but I'll wear it anyway.
Okay, it's cool. Yeah.
Thanks, Mark. But yeah, it's really remarkable. Like, and we got to 100, I think, within 24 hours. So yeah, and just like I noticed that if I post a link to something in the Discord that like is a site that I own, and I just like watch the server logs, if I post a link in even like an obscure channel, there'll be 8 clicks within like a minute from people to just coming into it. And yeah, I'm not, I don't know how to describe it. It's just like everyone I know in real life who's like involved in Helium 2 is just like, even if they're not technical, they're so interested. They just want to,
Yeah.
they want to keep learning every single nugget. And I think if there's any driver for success, it's going to be that just like organic enthusiasm. It's just seemingly never ending. Speaking of
Yeah, I think that,
enthusiasm, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, just to put a period, I guess, on that sentence, the part of this discussion, one of the coolest things is that we've built the world's largest public LoRaWAN network, primarily to date anyways, and this is changing, but primarily out of people who had no idea what LoRaWAN was. Right? We did it because we had, there's a blockchain that incentivizes people to create coverage. But more importantly, it's good coverage. Like, it's very good wireless coverage. Like the proof of coverage mechanism and the changes to it, HIP 15 and HIP 17 and sort of tweaks, and scaling factors and things like that, have resulted in very good LoRaWAN coverage created by people who did not know what LoRaWAN was, right? Additionally, we're sort of introducing a huge, massive new crop of people to the idea that they can mine their own crypto, which is, because you were active in a bunch of crypto networks, right? And you've gone on and bought expensive hardware to mine things, right? And you have to be reasonably technical to do it. This is an entirely different story, which is remarkable. So yeah, just wanted to note that.
Yep. Yeah. Most crypto mining is not accessible to your everyday folk. One thing that I really miss, I'm not going to lie, is the original Helium hotspot design. I kind of wish, like, would you guys ever open source that? I really wish someone
this
was,
one here?
yeah, that one that you can't get anymore.
The OG, that's what we call it, the OG.
I love the OG hotspot. It's just the design is so good.
It's very lovely. Yeah, it's right there.
There it is too. Yeah.
I don't know. That's a question for Coco. You'd have to talk to her. We get a lot of people who want to manufacture it, who come in and say, hey, can you open source the plans, or can we buy the licensed design? We've not done that. I don't know why we haven't done it. But at this point, that's the state of things.
Well, I'm looking, once light gateways come out, I'm looking for, the special edition, the SE. It's just going to be like a OG Helium hotspot, limited batch 1000. And
we'll do it as an NFT or something.
An NFT, a fundraiser, whatever it is, it's going to be lit, as the kids are saying. So speaking of enthusiasm, what do you see happening in cities and municipalities that do have so many of these use cases, like, the parking meters and the utility meters, and just so many things in cities that need to be tracked? What do you see happening there?
Yeah, so you mentioned parking meters. We just publicized a use case with a company called Nobel Systems about a month ago, maybe 3 weeks ago. We did a webinar with them where they worked with the city of some part of the city of Los Angeles. I think it was Huntington, and a LoRaWAN network provider, LoRaWAN sensor provider rather, called PlacePod, to do parking spot monitoring. So they drill a hole in the ground and they put this very slick sensor in the ground, and it monitors the presence of a car, metal technically, above it using I think it's a sonar sensor. And that was, an initiative that was driven from the top down in the city to basically streamline how they're doing sensor or monitoring for parking spots. And so that deployment was on the smaller side. I think it was 1,500 or 1,400 sensors on day one, and they've got like a ton of plans to expand in that municipality based on the success of the program. And so we're starting to see this interesting trend in cities specifically, where the sort of technical leadership inside of a city, so someone who's like a chief innovation officer or a chief technology officer, is understanding that the Helium network and like a LoRaWAN network, specifically Helium, can be built very quickly for low cost to provide sort of this omnipresent infrastructure for IoT. And you can do some really interesting things when you get the city involved in deploying coverage. So we haven't talked much about this publicly, and we probably won't for a while, but there's a few interesting initiatives afoot to, again, from at the leadership level in the city, to deploy helium coverage, use that coverage for sensing, and then use the output of that coverage, which would be HNT, to subsidize the cost of services for lower income housing. So I'm particularly excited about that. Like I said, there's nothing public out there on just yet, but I suspect we'll talk about it relatively soon. But that's a super, super cool story. I'm very excited about that.
I love that. That's the exact type of thing I love to see the most. I think we definitely democratizing access, but also democratizing the benefit by creating that access is just like huge. And there's no big barrier for lower income folks to host a hotspot if they have access to internet. And so if you can give them internet and subsidize that, you can also give them an opportunity to, you know, earn a little bit of extra income on the side. I think that's very cool. So we've been really positive in this conversation. You know, there's a lot of positive stuff going on, and, you know, we've talked a little bit of about downsides and whatnot, but like what's like the biggest challenge that you see for Helium in the next year and then the next 5 years?
I mean, the biggest challenge right now is coverage, specifically the hardware to create coverage. You know, we're still growing at a super fast rate. I don't know what we have an internal metric around number of days for the next 1,000 units to come online. That makes sense. So, you know, to go from 10 to 11, 11 to 12. And I don't remember the number off the top of my head. It's very fast. The last jump, right, from 18 to 19, I think was the slowest because, you know, the supply chain for these manufacturers has been so backed up. And so that doesn't make us happy, right? You know, again, even though it's probably the fastest growth of any of these networks out there, it still is well beyond or well behind what we want it to be. So that's the biggest challenge right now for us, and that'll probably be a challenge for, I would say, the next 2 to 3 months, 4 months. But now with 4 new manufacturers and a handful more that are about to submit applications actually for HIP-19, and the light hotspots, we should relieve the supply pressure. We're also going to do some stuff to enable. So with HIP-19, you're required to be able to either run the miner locally or soon just run the new packet forwarder. But most importantly, you have to be able to do encryption on the hotspot to generate keys and store keys that are used as part of the blockchain. Manufacturers are adding encryption capabilities to their products, specifically to suit the needs of the network, because they understand that people are trying to build coverage so fast and the use cases are growing very quickly. So I anticipate that that'll help us grow, but we are actually going to do some work to have what looks like, you probably remember that the DIY alpha code program where people could upload or onboard, you know, non-secured gateways essentially as full miner hotspots. We're not going to bring that back, but we are going to do we're going to let people basically route packets and earn HNT for packet routing with non-ECC'd gateways, if that makes sense. So that should help. We'll be talking more about that in the next couple of weeks. I would say the other challenge that we have is we have to make sure that the incentives are aligned to keep the network growing. That's like a huge thing that we think about all the time. HNT is produced at some fixed rate. You know, people know exactly where it goes. Right now, it's 30% to packet transfer, 30% to POC infrastructure, and then 30% to the sort of investor HST pool. How that sort of changes over time, if it has to make sure that people are still incentivized to create coverage. That's a thing that we sort of think about quite a bit. So I would say those are the two things that are top of mind in terms of challenges.
Well, it seems like lots of positives and few negatives, but there are constantly challenges. Like, we never know what the next challenge is going to be. I don't think anyone was really foreseeing the manufacturing delays. The first Helium hotspot was like relatively on time, but then like the second revision of the Helium hotspot was like 6 months late. And like the whole community has already been through this once before. And, we're just like going through it again. And we want to get to a point where that doesn't happen anymore.
I mean, what should happen is someone decides that they want to hotspot on a Tuesday and it shows up on a Friday. I mean, that's what should happen. And we'll get there soon enough. I mean, it pains us every day, right?
Yeah.
There are a handful of manufacturers now in the ecosystem that have the ability to produce just tens of thousands of units a month, right, to do that. So I think we'll get there. I don't know when, but we'll get there.
Do you have a sort of, just for fun, a prediction, a number of hotspots prediction for the end of 2021? I'll throw mine out there first, just so you don't feel all the pressure in the world.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be between 100 and 150,000.
Oh, I think you're low, my friend. I think you're low. I will bet you one HNT that we see.
Oh God, I can't afford this bet.
More than one. I think we see 150 pretty easily. If the supply issues get alleviated, I mean, I have knowledge of what's been purchased from the manufacturers already. I mean, it's significant, right? So if the supply issues get alleviated, I think I can tell you that the Helium internal projection is much higher than 150.
Well, Mark, thanks so much for joining this podcast. Really good to hear that things are going well and just are like exploding in terms of growth.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I never miss an opportunity to sort of talk about the BD side of the equation over here. Yeah, things are moving in the right direction. There's a ton of momentum, and we just we wake up every day. I mean, I've been here for 7 years, right? I wake up still every day remarkably excited to come and build this thing out. The more that we grow the community, the more that we grow our customer base, the more momentum we pick up, the more I want to do this. And everybody at the team feels entirely the same way. So yeah, thanks for having me on. It was a blast.
Awesome. Well, I'm excited to be a part of it. And yeah, hopefully we'll get you on here maybe in 6 months or a year, and we'll do the recap, see how things went.
Yeah, we can do a bit of a retrospective. And yeah, thank you, by the way, for all the work that you're putting in to grow the community and building tools and helping people deploy coverage. It's been an incredibly positive impact. That's fantastic.
I really appreciate it. Yeah, I feel the same energy that everyone else does. I feel the same urgency. The network just really does feel like this grand collective thing. And I'm sure it's like how people felt in the early days of open source software. Well, and especially now, I mean, open source is like completely taken over. It's just kind of magical that, all us strangers can come together in this wild time where we can't even go outside. We can make this network happen. That's very cool.
Do you remember I know we're running over here, but do you remember the first time you and I spoke in Slack? Do you remember that?
I can't say I do.
Before we transitioned.
Slack days, yeah.
Yeah, before. If I recall correctly, you messaged me. You're like, hey, I want to buy some hotspots, but they're expensive. Can I get a discount? I'm like, no, you can't.
Oh, yeah.
And then I think you asked me 2 or 3 more times, and I said something like, all right, here's what I'll do for you. You were going to buy, 5 or something or 10. And I said, I'll give you some small discount, but I'll also send you 2 free development boards. And all I ask is that you give a talk on it in the future. And
oh my gosh, that's right.
Yeah.
I forgot that was the origin of the, wow, I thought I was just like a self-motivated little developer, but yeah, you're right. You totally got me with the incentives. It's proven at this point that you don't need incentives for people to contribute, right? Just like being part of this thing is like incentive enough. So all really, really excited. Thanks so much again for your time. Talk again soon.
Yeah, thanks, Arman.
Take care.